Hawaiian Islands to Orient, contact clearance level 126.5.
And Chalk 6 is taking fire. Okay, divert south of the river. I see you come to the red guys and I just called over. Yes, damn well.
Since the dawn of the first age, by the elders it was foretold, a mighty cure that would rise when needed most. Their words would inspire enlightenment among the common. As it was prophesied, it has come to pass. Everybody has a podcast.
All right, so fart jokes and queefing and girlfriends aside, we've got actually a really great interview. Life-changing story. Let's go ahead and see if we can get him on the phone. Gentlemen, I'm really excited about our next interview. You've probably heard this guy on Dr. Drew's podcast, the podcast he does with Adam Andrew. We have with us Mr. Brandon Stogsdill. Brandon, how are you?
I am great. How are you?
Fantastic, man. Once again, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of time here. And Brandon, so Brandon is a child and adolescent therapist. You have your own practice, is that right?
Yeah, I work for the largest mental health agency in Seattle, and I have my own practice.
So that's those are pretty good credentials right there. But what's really interesting about Brandon is how he got there. I mean, traditionally, you would think when people go into mental health, go to college and mom and dad paid for it, everything works out. But Brandon, your story is a little bit different. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just a tad bit different.
So Brandon, I want to go ahead and say this before we get started here. So Brandon has written a book called The Boy with the Gun. You can find this on. You can find a link on Dr. Drew's podcast. It's sold on Amazon. Also, go to Facebook right now, actually, and like this page. And Brandon, it looks like you post on there regularly. Facebook.com/The Boy with the Gun. Brandon, who is the boy with the gun?
So the Boy with the Gun it's a true story, and it's about a young man who grows up in some pretty crazy situations. I guess it's all relative and all normal depending on how you hear the story, but like single mom, no dad raped mom. There was alcohol in the picture, multiple boyfriends. There would fight, police would come. There'd be substance abuse in the home, molestation, just pretty much everything bad you could kind of conjure up.
Your standard run-of-the-mill Friday night TGIF episode of Family Matters?
Yeah, it's all fun and love.
The boy with the gun is Brandon, and Brandon has had an amazing life. And that was, a quick synopsis. Do you mind just? I know you probably get asked this a million times. Would you mind telling us your story?
Yeah. So like I'm trying to tell you guys, I'm trying to give it a sales pitch.
Yeah,
give
definitely.
The readers a pit or like a hook. But it's a true story. It's about a teenager. It's about my story. Growing up in some rocky conditions, like I mentioned just a second ago, and then kind of coming to a point where I got really depressed. And just my mother went into a mental institution. My first love broke my heart. I was fell in school, got really depressed, and I was considering suicide on a daily basis. But instead, I decided to take my anger out on the world, and I started down a destructive path that had a lot of victims, and I've hurt a lot of people. And pretty much, I was just trying to, find myself and, scream for help. Unfortunately, while I was hurting other people. And in doing this path at 17, I got arrested and was sentenced to prison. I got arrested at 17 and was sentenced to prison for 4 years.
So at 17, you were sentenced as an adult, it sounds like.
Yes.
Wow.
And then while I was incarcerated, I guess the day the judge sentenced me, it just felt like I died, felt like my life was over, and I felt like that was it, and felt like I was going to be another statistic. 2 out of 3 inmates return to prison if they don't die and get caught up with more of that lifestyle. Like I said in Dr. Drew's podcast, the first week that I learned how to cook methamphetamine, whether I wanted to know or not.
Wow. And
you kind of learn, get a bunch of trades with a different population of people to support you. But however, I decided to change my life in there, waking up the next morning in prison, realized that I wasn't dead, and then embarked on a journey where I had kind of really no idea what I was doing. And faced with some of the most challenging obstacles I've ever been faced with in my life.
That's awesome.
So Brandon, you have a family. kind of talk to our listeners a little bit how they reacted when you were sentenced, and it was a foregone conclusion that you were going to go away for a while. Kind of elaborate a little bit on what that toll took on you, yourself, and also your family.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like I said, I grew up like my father was never in my life, and my mom was mentally ill. She was alcoholic, and she had her own mental illnesses. So there was a lot, I guess, to say neglect. But so there was a part of me that just kind of shut down and just forgot about my family. And I have a really great extended family, but I lost sight of that, and I just focused on friends and girls and the immediate moment and the here and now. And I lost sight of how important my family was. And then when I got sentenced, they were just as devastated I was. I mean, they were in tears. Literally, when we went to the final court date, it was like going to a funeral, and everybody just somberly sat back. And I tried to be positive because I was dating the prosecuting attorney's niece up until this point, which I thought was going to help me.
Yeah, you figured that would get you off, man.
Yeah, but and I talk a little bit more about that in the book too. But yeah, so they were devastated. And my brother, I guess, I just watched some commercial about a movie and how I guess it was Bruce Willis and he was about to hug his son, and they're like, "Yeah, we're not a hugging family." So I remember even my brother got up to hug me, but we didn't hug.
Right.
But and then that was like the first time I ever seen him cry, and then they were devastated, and I went and I was locked away.
What was really the first, I guess, step you took to kind of turning it all around? I mean, obviously you went to prison, and that was horrible, and that sucks. But that doesn't change a whole lot of people. Obviously, you alluded to that statistic. What for you was the turning point?
That is another great question. You guys are good. I think the first thing was I never thought about long term. I never thought about what I would put anybody else through. I thought it was just about me, and I was being very selfish. And I think in my book I talk about, you win some, that cliche, and you lose some. But for all the ones that I won, just were not worth the one that I lost. And I woke up, like I said, in prison, and I just remember feeling like the day before that I died. And I was like looking around, I was like, well, I mean, I'm surrounded by bars, not a very cool place, but I'm not dead. And if I'm not dead, I still have the ability to change my life, even in the depths of these prison walls. And I decided the first step was I need to change everything now. And the first three things I came up with were just to not prove anything to anybody else, just to be myself and not step on anybody's toes. And that was like my rules from day one. And in prison, those are kind of difficult to live by.
I can imagine. What's a typical day in prison like? I mean, particularly for such like a young boy, I imagine you would get a lot of flack just for that, right?
Yeah, I was a baby. I was very young. I mean, I went in there expecting prison to be just nothing but chaos, restless, light nights, just violence. I expected people to try. I mean, you've all seen movies. You guys all have your ideas. Everything you could think about prison, those were all in my head. Even my prosecuting attorney, she gave me this pamphlet that tried to like encourage me. And the first thing I read was like, don't take any sex or any gifts from anybody, because it pretty much implies you owe them a favor, and it's usually a sexual favor. And I just threw that away. So I went in there expecting just the absolute worst. So I just, went in there, kept my head up and back straight, and just tried to be confident. And I guess that's cliche as it sounds, live one day at a time.
Yeah, I mean, that's all you can do, right? And in the book, I know Brandon does list specifics of some stories in there that are really neat. So you guys need to read that and check it out. Brandon, so a question I have for you is, you've been through all this, but you've come to a really good point so far,
Yeah.
Because of all of this, you're able to do great things. Would you change anything, knowing that all this grief and all this trouble has led to where you are now, where you're able to help, kids like you were? Would you change it?
Man, that's a deep question, and that would even go back to how I was conceived. And I'll just say, like, my mother, like I said, she was a victim of rape. She got pregnant through this ordeal. Her friends persuaded her hard to get an abortion, and even though she was not fairly apt to do their best, she kept me nonetheless. And even a wealthy couple familiar with the situation when I was born offered to adopt me, and however she continued to raise me the best she could. And with all the circumstances of like the domestic violence, like the drugs being thrown around, the police coming, the molestation, the years of depression, the years of violence, just devastating lives. I went through a really hard time of just being remorseful, and when I got my faith, I became very repentant of the things I did. And to answer your question, like as crazy as it sounds, I don't think I would change it. I think I needed to learn those things. I think those are my choices that I did, and they've kind of brought me to the place I am. I mean, if I have the ability to raise a child, I'm going to do my best that they don't have to learn the way I learned. But for me, I'm pretty much, I feel confident in who I am now, the amends that I've been trying to make, that my faith has forgiven me for those things. And I have a whole new path ahead of me, and I could use my experiences to help other people. And that's what I've been doing my best at.
That's awesome, man.
So let me ask a quick question, because I'm not clear on this, and this might be a slightly offensive question. You can tell me to shut up if not.
No, go for it.
But okay, so you go to prison. You have a record, obviously, right? And now you're a licensed therapist, correct?
Yep.
How? I've always assumed, or I've thought that if you have a record or whatever, it kind of limits your ability to obtain certain professions. Like, you can't be a lawyer, I don't think, if you have a certain criminal past.
Look, man, just because Brandon operates out of a storage shed on the back of I-95, it doesn't mean anything, all right?
I was kind of wondering what your journey was to that process, or through that process, to get you where you are now, because that seems like a huge hurdle just to come over.
Well, that's Brandon, touch up on this, but once again, this is in the book, so I want everybody to read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, and just for the record, everybody that listens to this, I'm trying to do a better job at selling and not just putting all my information out there, because I'm a talker. Like, I love to share the story. I love to encourage people and to share my story to hopefully help other people. So I'm doing my best not to spoil it all. But that is an incredible question, and you are completely right. If people have felonies, they can't work with kids. They can't get certain jobs, and you are right. So this, I guess, to start, the answer to that question would be I was 19 in prison. I was listening to Dr. Drew, and this is why he's so paramount to me. I would listen to his show Loveline in prison on the radio, and I'd listen to the callers, and they would him and Adam Carolla would give them advice. And these guys, some of them just wouldn't pay attention, wouldn't get it, and I'd get irritated with them. And then one day I was like, man, you need some advice. Like, you need some help, so why don't you take their advice and apply it? So I started to learn about who I am, and that's why I could say about I didn't know this at 19, but growing up with a single mom and all that stuff, how it affected me, I would have said I didn't need a dad and I wouldn't have cared, but it hurt me deep down, and I felt abandoned. I would just never admitted it. So as I'm listening to the show, I am inspired to change my life even further. I'm empowered to just cut those allegorical strings that, like I'm on a puppet master, or like a puppet master has me on these strings that just be another statistic. So I'm able to cut those off, and then in doing so, I feel like God just revealed my purpose, and it was very crystal clear. And it was watching the news one day, and a kid, and this is a full-on chapter in the book. It's called "The Boy with the Gun," or "The Boy on the News." And he was getting arrested for something that I did, which I haven't told you yet, so that's in the book. Wink, wink. Mm-hmm. And but he was getting arrested for something exactly that I was getting arrested for. And I remember getting up, and I'm like, "You're just dumb. You had your whole life ahead of you." And then it was like one finger's at him, and I got 3, 4 pointed back at me, and I was like, "Dude, you're dumb. You had your whole life ahead of you." And then I looked closer at this kid, and I looked right into his eyes, and I just remembered, like, just understanding him. And I remember instantly I wanted to yell at him and say, "I know how you feel. You don't have to feel that way, and there's, like, better ways." And I just instantly discovered my purpose in life was to prevent that kid from standing in the very place that I went, that I was in prison. And I'm all fired up and inspired, and then I'm kind of like, holy smokes, I'm in a prison cell. The walls become ever so prevalent. And the first thing I'm thinking, you already blew that. There's no way you're going to be able to work with kids. There's no way someone's going to want a convicted felon to counsel their kids. So the next step was education, and education was something that I was never good at. I hated school. No one ever supported me. No one ever cared if I did well. I failed classes. I cheated. Girls did my homework. I only graduated high school just because girls did my homework. And I wanted to impress the judge while I was on bail. But I started to focus on education, something that was difficult, and realized that I could do. And then once I started making progress, long story short, I get out of prison, and the first thing that I do, as I started volunteering for a church that serves at-risk kids. And the first night I went there, I was expecting like 10, 12 kids singing Kumbaya, and it was far from what I expected. There was about 500 kids, I believe, in the parking lot, and it was in the Hilltop area near Tacoma, which is notorious for gangs, especially in the 80s. And I just shared my story to the people, and I told them I'll work for you, I'll do this, I'll bring in more volunteers, I'll bring in skate park competitions, I'll work for you, and all for free. And they let me do it, and I lived up to my word. And as I'm doing this, I hear about a snowboarding program that takes kids out, at-risk kids snowboarding, which is another idea that I had in prison, to use action sports as part of the therapeutic process, which I didn't even knew existed. So I get involved with the snowboarding program, again, volunteering, serving these kids, and just sharing my story. And I connect with one of the kids, and his agency is just impressed. They're like, how did you break through to him? He doesn't like or trust anybody. And they were like, well, we would love it if you'd like to be his mentor, his big brother. And I was like, I'd like that, but here's a problem. I was convicted of a felony, and I served 3.5 years in prison. I'm not sure if I'm able to do that. They're like, well, we'll support you if you try. So I gave it a shot. First thing that happened, just like you said, I got rejected. And then I applied again, or I appealed their process, and they rejected me a second time. So I ended up setting up an appointment with the Department of Washington's health department, and basically they told me straight up, their words were, and I quote, "You will never be able to work with kids. So just stop trying." Ouch. Yeah, and for whatever reason, I mean, I just knew deep down that God had a plan for me, and I just needed to do it. He wanted me to do it. And just, I'm going to go back a little bit too. Like, here I am at 19, a kid that used to shoot at kids and fight kids and steal from other kids, and someone who doesn't have an education and who's in prison at all the jobs in the world. This is like the one, to be a youth counselor is the one I most likely cannot do. And now the state's telling me I can't do it. I still push forward. I get my bachelor's. I went to UW on an honor scholarship, award-winning stuff for the work that I've done with kids, and went on to get my master's. And then after a couple years of fighting the courts in the state and lawyers, I proved to the state that I can be just a big brother, just work for free. And then from then on, I was able to get jobs at youth shelters, teen centers, which eventually led me to my position now as a licensed mental health counselor, child mental health specialist, and a chemical dependency professional.
That's amazing.
Wow.
So Brandon, I listened to your story earlier, and you talked about you had a bit of an epiphany. That kind of really, that was kind of the cornerstone of when you decided to make a change. At any point before that, did you get any piece of advice to help you make that decision? Like before that, did you rely on anything somebody had told you, or anything that kind of struck in your head when you made that decision that you basically said? And you know, not to spoiler anything in the book, but I remember specifically your first cellie telling you if anybody calls you a punk, you punch them in the face. And yeah. So at that point, whenever, that, because apparently to our listeners, and Brandon, I'll let you elaborate a little bit on that whole dynamic, because people are not, punk may not seem too egregious to a lot of our listeners, but apparently in the certain facility you're in, that is about as bad as you can be called. But did anybody give you any advice that kind of registered with you that time, or was it just something like a personal epiphany? Can you elaborate a little bit on that as well?
Yeah, now you got me thinking about the punk, which is also a great story, and it's so hard for me not to just blab it all out. I would love to tell you guys if you really want me to, but to answer your question, I mean, it was literally, I just believe, all faith. I had never wanted to work with kids. It was never an idea. Nobody ever, I knew worked with kids. No one ever suggested it. My family, which, again, like I realized how important they were after I screwed up, they supported me. My mom, she would come visit me every week. My aunt and uncles would come and visit me. My brother, my friends, and my cousins. They were very encouraging. But as I told them the stories in the visitings, I would say like, yeah, I'm gonna go to UW when I get out of prison. And they didn't want to be discouraging, but they realistically they're like, I don't know if you could do that. Like, you got a 1.87 GPA. You're in prison. Lots of kids want to go to the University of Washington, and I just had these ideas, and no one really told me I couldn't do it, but nobody really thought I would do it. And I just wrote these goals down, and they just started popping off. So
now that you've been working with youth for a while now, what do you think? What is your personal opinion or some outlooks you have on what are the bigger problems we have with youth these days?
I mean, we were on Dr. Drew and Adam Carolla's podcast not too long ago. We brought up how paramount parents are to children, mm-hmm. and we're in a society now, I think, where I think it's over 60% where of kids are going home alone without their dad or without their mom at home, and the family is just changing and morphing, and these kids are taking the brunt of it, and I think that is the biggest problem.
Just families not being intact.
Yeah, parents divorcing, cheating, substance abuse in the family, mental illness, and just not receiving the support and help, not communicating with their kids, not disciplining them appropriately, not explaining things, just kind of, if you do something wrong, smack them. It's not working. Just tough love is, the tough love works great in prison. That's why a lot of people are in prison. There's, I think, over 2 million people in the United States in prison, and 80% of the inmates grew up without fathers. That's not even including inmates that grew up without mothers. And for the most part, I talk about this in my book as well, a lot of the inmates, I would recall their stories, they would have horrendous physical abuse. I'm talking about if they didn't finish every last morsel on their plate, their dad would strap on their steel-toe boots and stomp them and kick them out.
And they're so it's a cyclical problem as well, right? I mean, it's we have someone who is raised wrong, and then they go back and they do the same thing.
Yeah, I talk about this theory called the Letdown Theory. Like when we're let down by the most important people in our life, our parents, we tend to make choices that let ourselves down further. And that usually, Dr. Drew coins it, the gift that keeps on giving. This just interlegacy, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's physical abuse, it's the gift that keeps on giving across legacies, and it's unfortunate.
Brendan, I wanted to talk to you about this in particular. I first heard you on Dr. Drew's podcast the first time you were on, and once again, blew me away, man, your story. Like you, I have spent many, many years listening to Loveline, and I think anybody, you listen to 1 or 2 episodes, you're hooked, Yeah. I would subscribe, anybody, any kid, 5 years of Loveline, just listen,
and it's entertaining, it's informational, and I mean, if you apply some of their advice, you will see some changes. Like Adam Carolla was saying the other day, just like take some advice from people that have been through it before. You're gonna learn it a lot quicker. But we're in a society where we have to all do it ourselves and figure it out on our own and take the hard route.
Yeah,
America.
What are your thoughts on? I know what I think, and I know the truth. And I'll be glad to say it here in just a sec. But I wanted to talk to you real quick about, have you heard much about, a lot of the flack that Dr. Drew gets for doing shows like Celebrity Rehab and all of the hate he gets on Twitter?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, because, again, Dr. Drew has, not only did his show, penetrate the walls of my prison cell, and he helped literally change my life, help me understand a lot of the traumas, again, stuff I talk about in detail in the book. After I even get out of prison, this guy, believed in a book that I wrote, one of the first people to believe in a book that I wrote. I have no business writing books, everybody. I failed English, and he was ready to support it right off the bat. He would have me come to the studio to hang out. He would check in with how I'm doing. If I was having girl problems, I could count on this guy to help me out. If I was having, just thoughts on some type of project that I want to implement, he'd share me his thoughts. He even wrote me letters of recommendation to get in school. He even told me to apply or to focus on a PsyD program, which is a doctorate in clinical psychology that focuses on client-based research methods. And now I will start a PsyD program this fall because of his advice, and he helped me get here. So he's somebody I truly admire, respect fully. So when I see the media and people just attacking him for doing shows like Celebrity Rehab, it literally infuriates me. It really annoys me, and it really bothers me. One, because he is doing things not to, for the most part, he has to make ratings, but for the most, what he does, it's to help people. Celebrity Rehab is to provide services and treatment for these substance abuse or love addiction, what have you. And just because these people continue to make poor choices and then unfortunately hurt themselves, like what we're seeing in the media, it doesn't mean it's his fault. Like, only thing I could say is if we have an orphanage of kids where their parents abandon them, and then say we have a couple that opens up an orphanage for these kids and tries their best to raise them with the little they got, some of these kids are going to grow up and do terrible things, and we cannot blame the orphanage, just like we can't blame Dr. Drew for trying to help them. So it's like, to me, and I'll probably get a lot of flack for this, I think when people accuse him of it is just ignorance.
I agree 1,000%. One example I like to list is Teen Mom. You know, everybody calls this trash, and this is just horrible television. And what people aren't understanding is, number one, that's not your target demo. If you're a 52-year-old man, you're not supposed to be watching Teen Mom anyways. You're supposed to think it's retarded, and you're not supposed to watch MTV. That show is for 14-year-old girls, and it's to show them this is what it's like. And I think Drew said on his own specific, on his podcast, you know, they were able to see that teen pregnancy rates went down drastically when that show aired. And yeah, Drew's not doing it. Yeah, he's not doing it to make money or get famous. You know, I'm sure the man has a nice, you know, little pile of money, and everybody already knows who he is. He's doing this to genuinely help society, and I hate all of the flack that he gets on Twitter. It's just unjustified. It really makes me mad as well.
Yeah, and just in therapy in general, why I became a counselor is to put things into light, is to communicate things that are hurtful and trauma in our past. It's unpleasant to talk about these things. We'd rather keep it secret, and that's where it stays safe, but that's where it also festers and gets worse. So for Dr. Drew to put stuff like sub rehab in the limelight, like, people are learning about abuse, learning about addiction. Like, I used to think that addiction was it was just choices, and people had no willpower, and through this information, being exposed to it on the media and his shows, like, it is a disease, it is predictable, there is treatment. Love addiction, that's something I did not think existed until I started to learn his shows, and then with my own graduate level education, learn that it is something that is true. So he's putting things out there, and he's doing it pretty creatively too, and it's, again, he's trying to help people, and maybe his producers or maybe people behind him are trying to tweak it to get more ratings, but ultimately he's very compassionate. He's in it to help people.
Yeah, that's my question. Is that's kind of tough, because the big question, and obviously he's not here to speak on this subject, but you kind of wonder, how do you balance helping people with getting ratings? Because really, I mean, when you're helping somebody, it's not, I mean, for you, it's probably the most interesting thing in the world, given what you've gone through. But, there's a lot of just really kind of borderline, semi-dull stuff that might be talked about for 30 minutes. We can't have that on TV. How do you balance that long term? I wonder how you balance that long term to get ratings and keep yourself, and your show in the limelight to where you're helping a whole bunch of other people. Without, totally abandoning the help part.
Yeah, our culture, we love drama. That's why all the news is all about negativity. It's all about shooting. It's all about crime, so we can accelerate our heart rate and be focused on something that's more dramatic than our own lives. So I think Dr. Drew is the best person to answer how to do that. But we are addicted to chaos. We love instant gratification. We love drama. Well, that's why we all look at the side of freeways when there's a car accident, and that's why we watch air shows in case the plane's going to crash. So,
well, Brandon, hey man, thank you so much for giving us some time. I know you're a busy guy. I'm really happy that you were on Dr. Drew's podcast. I'm really happy that I was able to hear your story. I want everybody else to hear your story as well. Once again, guys, go to his Facebook page, facebook.com/theboywiththegun. Go to drdrew.com. There's a link to the book there. Is there anything else, Brandon, you've got going on you want to talk about?
No. I was just going to say, drdrew.com. You can find the book, The Boy with the Gun, and we're doing a lot of stuff right now. Actually, the media just came out last week to show my work with kids, and it's kind of a novel topic where, again, we're taking youth in therapy and using action sports as a means to transform their risky behavior into a constructive outlet, increase their cardiovascular endurance, strengthen therapeutic alliance, et cetera, and we're starting to get some movement from that. We're going to start some research to try to make this idea that developed in a prison cell to actually make it legitimate and help people. So
awesome. Well, hey, Brandon, if you're ever in Austin, man, stop by. I'd love to buy you a beer.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, you guys, and take care.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, man.